invite I now invite the chair of I now invite the chief executive panel to introduce the panel for the final, as well as the chair for the final.
Okay, welcome to the grand finals of SLSDC 2021. The panel that will be judging the finals today will be chaired by Litmal. On the rest of the panel is Amanda, Daniela, Minul, Senit, Shalom, and myself. We will be starting the debate shortly. Thank you.
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I can be heard, right? Right. A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the grand final of the Sri Lanka Schools Debating Championships 2021. A very good morning to all the debaters, judges, and all the well-wishers who are present here today. And congratulations to both teams for making it this far. We have on team proposition, we have CISA. Give a round of applause. And on team opposition, we have Ladies College A. And the stopwatch will be shared by Amanda. And if you guys have no clarifications, the motion for the grand final will be: this house regrets the westernization of elites in post-colonial states. Examples: predominantly speaking English, attending Western schools or universities, and predominantly consuming Western media and music, etc. So if there are no issues and clarifications, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to present the case. Here.
Thank you. I can be heard, yes? Great, okay. Before I start, preferred pronouns are they, them. I will be taking POIs verbally, so just unmute yourself and ask. Congratulations to Ladies College for making it thus far. Looking forward to a good debate. So do I just start when ready? Great. Ladies, gentlemen, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, I recognize the irony in this debate considering I'm from CIS, but we need to recognize one thing. My culture was stolen from me. My culture was stolen from me by an elite class that chooses to emulate the white man. My language, my history, my insight, my morality were taken away from me, and that is greater than any physical harm that colonialism could have done because it detriments my identity as a human being. It invalidates me and it dehumanizes me and tells me that I am a savage. Instead of the purity of my culture, instead of an actual culture that means something, I had to replace my culture with a bastardized version of Sri Lankan culture based on the emulation of the white man. That is not something that any of us should be in support of. That is why we propose this motion. Few clarifications, counterfactual, etc., before my argumentation. When we say elite, we're talking about the rich and powerful. It can be in terms of political power, it can be in terms of monetary or capital, etc. In terms of post-colonial states, I think that's quite obvious. Sri Lanka, Africa, parts of Asia, etc. Two burdens in this debate. Firstly, that westernization of elites was detrimental to decolonization. Secondly, that it entrenched unjust power disparities. What is our counterfactual? We prefer a world in which elites wouldn't have existed at all, obviously. But since both sides of this debate have to concede that elites do exist, in our world, in the liberation struggle, we would have gotten rid of and entrenched decolonization in all its forms. And this includes culture and replaced the colonial culture with a nationalized form of culture. This is different from ethnicized culture. So for example, languages like Sinhala and Tamil both would have been made mandatory while English was deprioritized. In terms of media, etc., like watching westernized films would have been looked down upon. We would have instead looked at Sri Lankan books or Sinhala books or Tamil books, Tamil film, etc. Okay, since I've cleared that up, before my argumentation, go ahead.
Do you regret elites in minority communities learning the language of the majority?
Sure, if that means that they are unable to represent themselves, and because of the fact that that means that in order to be considered valid, you need to pander to the majority, absolutely, yes, we regret that as well. All right. First argument as to why it was detrimental to the process of decolonization. What I want you to understand at the top of this argument is the context of a post-colonial state. And that is to say, the main goal of this state is to engage in decolonization because of the wake of destruction left behind by colonialism, like loss of identity, dependency on the West, etc. The importance of this context is to say that the elite hold power in society, and they are the ones who are able to do things like create change because they hold the political capital within these countries. Considering that, three key mechanisms as to why like westernization of the elite is purely immoral. Firstly, the fact that it changes social aspirations, because by definition, an elite group is a group of people that you are supposed to emulate and be like. That is to say that in our world, we associate the elite with Western culture, because that is how the elite distinguish themselves from the non-elite in a world with westernization. That means that now the majority aspire towards this culture. That means that you're forced to do things like ignore local traditions, do things like change your hairstyle, etc. This means that you're forced to give up on your own identity and dehumanize yourself. But secondly, it entrenches Western culture. Because the elite hold a cultural hegemony to entrench Western culture, that means that Eastern culture had a great amount of power post-colonialism. Why is Western culture bad in almost all its forms? Because Western culture, no matter what it is based on the subjugation and destruction of the black and brown body. That is to say that Western success is purely based on the back of slavery. Be it the Industrial Revolution, be it the Enlightenment, all of that was based on the power disparity between the white man and the black man. And that still continues in today in the form of entrenched colorism through things like promotion of products like Fair and Lovely that tell you in order to be elite and be successful, you need to change your skin color. That's a uniquely harmful thing because it dehumanizes you for something you have no control over.
Here.
But thirdly, it does things like entrench Western morality, which hinders progress. Because recognize that the way that social morality works is a trickle-down system. That is to say that social morality starts with the elite and then trickles down. The main way this has happened, especially in countries like Sri Lanka, is the oppression of gay and transgender individuals because of colonial systems of morality. Before colonialism, queer individuals in Sri Lanka were liberated. Examples, King Buwanaka Bahu VII had a gay harem, for example. It was the colonial morality that was entrenched and pushed on our people that caused them to fall into traps of morality that prevented moral progress. So all that the westernization of the elite has done is continue the subjugation of our national identity. That is not just, that is regrettable. All right. My second argument now is going to prove to you why it entrenched unjust class structures. First thing I'm going to prove to you here is the context of class structures in post-colonial states. Because recognize that elites in and of themselves exist as a result of colonialism. That is to say, the easiest way for you to gain power during the occupation of colonial powers was to pander to the elites. This is important because that means that the power structures in these countries are already colonial and westernization makes it worse. On our comparative, when you decolonize those systems, you on comparative on their side, you don't have an active attempt to break down the inherent colonial structures that exist, the internalized patriarchy, the internalized colorism, etc. Considering this, three mechanisms as to why that detriments individuals in these countries and entrenches an unjust power disparity. Firstly, because it changes the way in which intellectualism is perceived. That is to say, to be intellectual, you had to be westernized and have Western culture. That is because it was Westerners, unlike the elite, who were able to actually go to Western universities. This means that you now entrench that power disparity, because it means that these universities are easily able to dismiss non-elites as stupid or savages because they don't know the English language. That is terrible, because these individuals are the ones we should be hearing out the most, because they are the ones that have the most important revolutionary cultural ideas as a result of being those that are oppressed. But what this did was allow colonial powers to continue to determine our cultural validity. I don't think that you should have to change your language and learn the language of the majority, because your validity as a group isn't based on what the majority wants. We don't care. And this continues today in forms of things like elocution, where individuals are forced to change the way in which they speak. This is purely abhorrent. But secondly, it ignores the local needs and struggles of people, because the people that are now in the spotlight are the educated classes, and the elite classes, they have no actual understanding of the needs and wants of the poor. In contrast, on our side, you don't need representation in Western institutions to gain that validity. You give yourself that validity by the nature that you are a brown person. So considering this, you get better at, you actually get better care for the needs of the oppressed on our side. But thirdly, it facilitates the accrual of capital on their side. Because the rich continue to have access to Western education while the poor don't, the system treats Western education as a requirement, which means that the rich continue to get access to jobs and get access to higher paying jobs because those jobs are entrenched in Western systems. All this means is that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and the culture is lost. Your identity is crushed. Panel, the situation we live in right now is one of continued colonialism via the westernization of elites. I don't think that's a world I want to live in. That is a world I'd prefer to live without. Propose.
Everyone in the panel is okay to continue?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Speaker. And in order to commence the case for side opposition, I would like to invite the opposition leader. Here.
Can I be seen and heard? Yep.
Yep.
Panel, I think side proposition is well on their way to losing this debate the moment they try to conflate these elites with the colonizers themselves. It's extremely insulting to the kind of progress that we have achieved within Sri Lanka, within so many post-colonial countries in terms of regaining our cultural identity and the institutions that we have built up to protect them, for Ashwin to then tell us that we have a completely bastardized version of Sri Lankan culture. We have a system within our countries where people who don't even go to these Western universities, who don't even fluently speak English that well, are still holding powerful positions within parliament, who are still extremely rich and wealthy people who still continue to contribute greatly to society. I would rather argue that none of that progress would then be possible on that paradigm, where those elites in the past started viciously holding on into local culture without adapting to the systems that they were put in that allowed us to decolonize and gain independence in the first place. On their counterfactual, they tell you that they would prioritize local culture within your freedom struggle and within the time after that. No mechanization as to how you're likely to gain that independence on their side of the house anyway. They need to tell you why within structures where English is mandatory, where all this culture is imposed on you, you're then likely to be able to combat those things without having any kind of stake in them. A few points of rebuttal. Firstly, when it comes to decolonization and how that should be your main goal. No reason as to why decolonization itself is that important. I would rather say that learning to adapt to an increasingly globalized world and learning to find your way through it is the most ideal way to go. But let's take it on their best case, right? They tell you that the association of these elites with westernization leads to an abandoning of identity. Identity is not as monolithic as they paint it out to be. It is something that is extremely complex. It's not something at the point at which you start speaking English, you completely abandon your local culture. We think those things coexist and continue to coexist. They also tell you that Western culture itself is inherently harmful. This is an extremely reductive stance to take. I can tell you that every single culture on the face of this planet has its pitfalls and its benefits. I don't think that Western culture itself is inherently bad, or that Sinhalese or any other culture is inherently good. There are things that are good and bad about all of those things. It's not a monolith. They also tell you that all these post-colonial countries were liberal fantasies before these Western people came in and started imposing their structures on us, right? Let's not delude ourselves. We don't think that we had any kind of structural protection for LGBT youth or for any of those people within these post-colonial cultures prior to colonization. We would rather argue that those conditions were dismal to begin with, and the only way that you're going to be able to progress is now when you have systems like democracy where people understand the inherent value of their own rights. Anyway, none of that really matters and factors into regretting this anyway, because they need to tell you why these elites themselves have caused all of the harms that they're talking about. Things like having Fair and Lovely within your supermarkets where people are aspiring to go to higher universities. Those are the things that they need to prove to the House today. We don't think they have done that. They also tell you that you entrench things like power systems in terms of monarchies and intellectual elitism. Why is that uniquely the fault of elites? Rather, things like intellectual elitism is something that existed within these countries during the colonization process when English was made mandatory. These elites then only learned how to adapt and bring our country forward to the point where we didn't have to have those things mandated anyway. I'll be moving on then into a few points of recontextualization. When it comes to these elites, we have that there are people who are extremely powerful and hold economic capital, but they're not every single person, right? It creates a good balance in terms of the people who exist within our society and have power over our society. Ultimately, you have policies that directly benefit people because the vast majority of your population wants your culture to stay intact. You have that pressure to make sure that you don't have all of our systems collapsing. And when it comes to post-colonial states, understand that these were places that were previously colonized, meaning that they were structurally changed when learning English and having these systems imposed within them. Currently, there is a cultural revival where you have local languages brought to the forefront. You have things like Sinhalese and Tamil being spoken in parliament. What these elites have done is brought back Western ideas and integrated into our world. On our counterfactual, we are fine with status quo. Our burden to prove is that Westernization itself has been beneficial for post-colonial countries by serving as a vital part of gaining independence and by equalizing the power that Western influence had after independence. And therefore, it's not. I'll be moving on into my first argument on why westernization happened and why it's justified. On a first level, what does colonization itself looks like? It looks like the imposing of laws and the changing of our education and language structures to the point where it was well established over several centuries. This means that you have structural reforms within these countries that make it nearly impossible to get anywhere and combat any kind of foreign influence in the absence of you having direct access to those things. Why is it then better on our side of the house? The role of westernization of these elites is that it directly gave them the kind of autonomy that they needed to start combating those structures. Why is this important? Because you saw these elites learning English and going to universities abroad and bringing back their political and intellectual capital to then take these Westerners and colonizers on their own ground. That is simply not something that you can see happening on their side of the house, because those people wouldn't have done that anyway. They would have been holding on to local culture without adapting to the structures that were imposed on them. Why was this necessary for independence? And understand that the setting up of post-colonial structures was contingent on the power that these people got by assimilating to Western culture to some extent. People like D.S. Senanayake directly learned English and started assimilating to those things to some extent. And after he was elected and they got rid of Western influence to a large extent, he was then able to start uplifting local cultures and building up local culture. None of that could have happened if you didn't have the adaptation happening in the first place. The third level then, as I wrap up this argument, is that colonization on a global scale has set a normative standard. This means that the post-colonial world is going to exist on either side of the house. You're going to have English being spoken as the main language. You're going to have structures like Western liberal ideas being imposed in a large majority of places because these European countries held political capital prior to colonization as well. The question of the debate then becomes, but not whether colonization itself was good or bad, but rather which side then has learned to adapt and continues to adapt to a changing world and builds up our country in the aftermath of colonization. The second argument then is on the benefits and the unique benefits of that this has brought to us. As I told you, Western influence is something that is inevitable, meaning that it's going to happen regardless on either side of the house. On a first level, why is it important that you have access to things like uniquely Western ideas through things like liberalization and democracy? If I compare it to their comparative, you have a conscious rejection of those ideas because you have things like democracy and liberalization being inherently tied to a Western connotation. Those leaders and elites then will then directly oppose those ideas because they come with the packaging that these are things that Europeans enshrine, these are things that the Europeans value. That is when you have a conscious rejection of those things. Why is it uniquely beneficial on our side of the house? Firstly, because you increased the marketplace of ideas within these countries. As soon as these elites learned all of these ideas within foreign universities and brought those ideas back, we were then able to point out the hypocrisy of these colonizers in terms of how they preach equality but don't allow us to have it anyway. That is when you're able to take them on their grounds and start establishing a post-colonial state that was functional and continues to function extremely well. On our side of the house, we take a realistic look at what this colonization looks like, and we are better equipped to continue to adapt. We urge you to oppose.
Everyone in the panel ready to continue? Awesome. Guys, just before we continue, slight reminder to all the observers to mute their mics and keep their videos switched off. And just in case like the screen share stops, please pay attention to the chat. Amanda will be sending the timestamps there as well. All right, thank you very much. And now moving on with the debate, I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to present their case. Here.
Give me a minute. Can I be seen and heard? Okay. Starting in 3, 2. Side opposition loses this debate when they assume that Western culture is just like every other culture. We say no, most other cultures haven't profited off of oppressing most cultures around the world. By the 17th century, the British controlled 3/4 of the world. We think this in itself means that while their culture may have ups and downs, the very fact that they subjugated and enforced their culture on other cultures means that they don't get the same leeways that other cultures do for having a few bad parts, right? But let's talk about the assumptions they made in their case. The assumption they made is that the bringing back those Western ideas are good, and that if we don't adapt, and if we adapt to this, it will be a good thing, right? We say that no, by adapting in itself, you forget your own culture. By adapting, you identify that this culture is superior to you and this culture is something important. We think any culture that has profited off the subjugation, the alienation of you from your race, the idea that your culture was so attacked by this very idea, and that now you adapt to it, means that you now by adapting concede to all the harms they do, right? But also, this debate isn't about how you gain independence. If anything, it's about how what we did to get independence, and how these elites profited off by getting independence has created the harms that Ashwin gave. No, ma'am, right? But one clash today. But before I move on to that, let me tell you why the rebuttals they gave about Ashwin's speech doesn't necessarily stand, right? First of all, they talked about how learning to adapt is a world idea. We say that no, right? It's not, because when you adapt and when we identify this culture right now is that we've been forced to assimilate to Western culture, and this forced assimilation has led to us forgetting our own identity. And now you adapt to the world. What this looks like is us losing the culture that we lost and we barely had to begin with. What this looks like is me speaking less and less Sinhala because English seems like the cooler language, because English is what the world wants me to learn, and how I can't survive in the world now if I can't speak English. We think we shouldn't care about the world, right? If anything, these countries should adopt a national language, because that's what benefits them the most. We think we should be like countries like Japan, where they speak majority Japanese, and this means that they depend less on the world. We think we shouldn't bow down to the metrics of success that the Western world has categorized, especially considering the only reason they're successful is because of the colonialization and the capitalism they gained through this. But on another level, they talked about how you don't abandon your identity just because you speak English. We say that no, right? You abandon your identity when you start thinking in English, when you start assuming that English is better, when you stop listening to Sinhala songs because you think English songs are better just because they're in English. We think that's the problem. The problem with these elites is that these elites, what happened was they enforced us to learn Sinhala and Tamil, but then sent their children to foreign universities during Cinema Bandaranaike's era. We think that's the problem, the hypocrisy in it, right? The fact that they enforced the rest of the people to bow down to this. But moving on, the idea of structural protection, etc., existed. We think that no, the idea of democracy existed. We think African tribes had democracy. We think that these tribes had democracy, and even in Iran, you had a democracy. Western culture replaced that democracy with a dictator. We think, if anything, that you can't necessarily say that democracy comes through Western cultures. But moving on to my clash, right, which is which side, end of the day, creates a better place for all those living in these post-colonial countries. This is where we tell you that, first of all, look, the progress we've achieved is minute compared to the harms that we've had. Even the progress that they say, which is adapting policies like that are helpful for LGBT community, comes through westernized ideas. Now, even if a politician and elite adopt a policy of acceptance for LGBTQ, etc., it's based on Western acceptance. Now, right now, we need to depend on the West to be progressive. We need to depend on the West to accept us so that we can pass out this acceptance-based legislation. We think this is the problem, right? Even if all these elite pass out good policies, the fact that this is based on Western morality, that's the problem. Even if DS Sena Nayak got an education from university and tried to instill those values, we think it's still not good enough. Because end of the day, what happens to the majority is that now we've lost our country. We gave you in Ashwin's speech the idea of LGBTQ communities, etc. existing before. What this looks, no ma'am, what this looks like is now us being called savages because we don't accept the LGBT community when we did to begin with. What this looks like is us now having to depend on the West for progression. We think the idea of Western morality is extremely problematic, considering the fact that they burnt witches at the stake because women were intellectual, and they castrized gay men for being gay. We think the idea of us having to subjugate ourselves to that is extremely problematic. They also talked about how the European held capital before colonialism. We say that even if they did hold capital before that, the very idea that the reason why they're so powerful in the current context is because of colonialism. This idea that the problem with elites is that the reason why elites are powerful in this context is because they take money from the poor, right? What the elite do is they send their children to universities. They encourage people in Sri Lanka, but by sending their children to universities, they now set the idea that foreign universities is better. Poor people in Sri Lanka now struggle to accumulate money, and when they do, they send their children off to universities as well. Then what happens is now they pass off policies for bettering education. They take loans from the IMF to better education, but we don't have capital, right? Because those kids who go to foreign universities don't come back. Brain drain, I'll talk about that in my argument. But even if they do, what happens is you have this culture of going to foreign universities, but what that happens is there's no point in us investing more money in our education and taking out loans, which is what these politicians do, when we don't have a way of paying it back. We can't pay it back now because we don't get capital, because most of the good people leave. But moving on to my argument, right, which is the harms to governance. First of all, we say that twofold: domestic and international. On a domestic basis, we say that, look, the economy is based off in a way that we have extremely over-reliance on foreign countries. This is to say that these powerful countries, the Western economies, they want us to be dependent on them. We see this with the South China Sea and USA not being needed to get involved in that, but they only got involved because of the fact that they want these countries to see, these South Asian countries, to see that we can help you out. We think that the West profits off of our dependence. What this looks like is neo-colonialism in the current context, because we think that they are great. Elites have now brainwashed us into thinking that Western approval, etc., is what matters. We now only depend on the West. So now this looks like us not improving our economy, instead taking out loans from foreign entities, instead of depending on foreign products, only considering foreign products superior to us and not improving the domestic economy. We think it's extremely harmful. But brain drain. Right? Brain drain is problematic because we now invest more in Western education. We think the very idea that Western education is superior is inherently not immoral, on the simple basis that what it do, because most Western education, for example, Oxford, was profited off and was held by people who directly contributed to colonialism. But on another level, we think what this leads to is less antagonism through other people, right? What this looks like is poor people now hating the rich and complying less with the government on the basis that they are told that they are inferior. What this looks like is kids who go to local unis hating kids who went to foreign unis because they think that they are superior. This is why most local kids who go to local unis go and protest in the streets, because they think that it's not fair that those kids get to parade and take the jobs that they worked hard for. We think this antagonism inherently leads to less government compliance. We think it's a problem. For all these reasons, problem.
Everyone in the panel okay to go? Awesome. Just reminding you that there will be timestamps in the chat. This goes to the debater because for the purposes of live streaming, we have been requested to use timestamps instead of screen share. All right. I thank the speaker for that speech. And now I would invite the deputy opposition leader to continue the case for side opposition. Here.
Can I be seen and heard clearly? Side proposition loses its debate, the point at which they can't even mechanize the counterfactual, but more importantly, the point at which, is anyone unmute? Is it okay if I start again? Side proposition loses its debate, the point at which they can't even mechanize their counter solution, but more importantly, the point at which they bring colonization and westernization to the same level of harm. And we believe there's a clear distinction between those two. I'll deal with that in my first clash, and my second and third will deal with which side better preserves culture and which side is better able to engage in the world market in terms of politics and economics, before my argument on how we better the job market, how the job market is worsened in their counterfactual. So the first question in terms of the distinction, and no, the point, it's too late for the prop 3 to come up and bring back a unique distinction between those two, given that the first two speeches made these two almost symmetric. But there's a distinction. Why? Because the point at which we believe Western culture, its core values are associated with things like speaking English, with things like liberalism, with things like democracy. And culture in itself is separate to the people who use that culture to oppress. What we think is the distinction here is that the problem is rather with the manner in which the England or colonizers themselves mechanized culture, and not with the core values of the culture. And therefore we think there is a clear distinction between them. And we think the point at which they make these two symmetric, that is when any of the unique benefits that you can have a result don't exist on their side of the house, but more importantly, they undermine what exactly colonization really was on their side. But let's look at who better colonizers on their side of the house. We think that firstly, they gave us no mechanization whatsoever about how you deconstruct structures of democracy that were established by the Western colonizers. But we think, how do we deconstruct them better? One, we think the point at which we're debating this debate in the context where colonization has already happened, and a context where globalization has already happened, and there's an inherent power asymmetry between colonizers and colonized nations. Because the point at which any other structure in the world, like the UN or like the Commonwealth in itself, function under these colonizers or on the basis of systems like democracy, we as nations have a back foot. How are we able to better decolonize them? Because one, the very reason that colonization happened in the decolonization and the process happened in the first place was because elites had access to information that allowed them to combat colonizers on the same level. Because we wouldn't have policies that benefited and protected our culture, the point at which our elites refused to engage with Westerners and refused to engage with them within parliament and whatnot. Because the only way we had DSA and Naik and whatnot in parliament is because they went to get Western education. But even after that, after the process of colonization in post-colonial states, the only way we were able to, in fact, further establish better systems of democracy and reform them is because the elites continued to go abroad and continue to have access to this unique knowledge. And that is why we're better able to establish democratic structures that better provide equality to people. And we think the point at which they equate all the harms of colonization with the harms of westernization, which we don't think are symmetric, we take that clash. But the second clash, and more important, who preserves this culture? They run us two lines of argumentation that can't exist in the same world. Why? They tell us, one, that elites are forcing everyone to preserve culture and they aren't doing it themselves, and that is inherently hypocritical. But then their first speaker comes up and tells us that these elites are forcing Western culture onto people in the first place. They can't run these two argumentations given that they can't exist in the same world. But what we think actually happens is elites themselves are a small minority. Yes, they have a lot of power within politics whatsoever, but the point at which they themselves, being politicians, depend on a voter base that values their culture and values their language above all else, that is when you're likely to these politicians and elites themselves to be held accountable in status quo, where elites can't completely disregard what the poor want, disregard what you as an individual want for your culture. And we think that is how we preserve culture, where elites are held accountable under existing systems of democracy that wouldn't have otherwise exist on their paradigm, the point at which you actively reject Western principles. But more importantly, we think the very mechanization of preserving culture can only exist when you have access to financial aid and access to political capital that allows you to mechanize these kind of policies. How so? Because they're able to fund things like Ayurveda and just hospitals or institutions that preserve arts and crafts of Sri Lanka, the point at which you engage with on the point at which you are able to engage with the world market and adapt to those kind of principles. This moves me on my second question of how you're better able to engage with the world market and the world as a whole. Because their paradigm, the point of conflate westernization with colonization, but in general, the point at which you as an individual and as an elite who has a political capital to engage in things like the UN and engage in things like foreign affairs, etc., that is when you completely alienate any form of Western rhetoric, which is harmful given the fact that this kind of Western rhetoric is what facilitates your ability to have trade ties. The point at which they run argumentation saying that Sri Lanka depends on the world, etc., and that's a problem in terms of, first we think that's factually incorrect because Sri Lanka in itself is quite protectionist, but we think the point at which you as an individual continue to isolate your country, that's when you cut off an access to aid, cut off an access to foreign relations that you can have in better upholding your culture at the end of the day. Because they cannot deny the inherent power asymmetry that will exist on both sides of the house. On our side, we're able to reduce their power asymmetry by increasing the amount, by allowing your elites to have access to education, to have access to these kinds of knowledge, and therefore engage on a global scale with the Western nation. This moves me on in my argument because we think the point at which they still haven't mechanized a counter solution, and we think that is contingent on them winning this debate, given the fact that they need to have unique benefits on their counterfactual. We've had unique benefits in status quo. The very fact that we're functioning as democracy in terms of preserving minority rights, etc., function only because of this westernization. We take this debate. This moves me on into my argument in terms of the impacts it has to you as an individual level in the job market. And this is why I directly analyze their respond to their argument about how you cut off jobs, etc. We think that they can't run argumentation how elites are actively cutting off jobs and getting richer, the point at which elites themselves are a minority. What we think will happen on their counterfactual is when you regret westernization, you regret institutions that function within principles of that is you regretting every single university that was set up here after colonizers came. But that is you regretting the teaching of law and philosophy within these institutions, which means now in their paradigm, all of these elites' children or anyone who accepts Western culture is no longer able to go abroad because they're making this conscious choice to reject Western culture. That's when you as an individual now has to go into local unis, which we don't even know whether they would exist on their side of the house, given the rejection of culture, which means now it's an overcrowding of these universities. And that is when that inherent disadvantage to minorities and disadvantage to marginalized communities happen, because that is when they don't have access to jobs, the point at which you cut off them having access to education. But more importantly, we think you harm minorities, the point at which in post-colonial societies, where usually the party that is in control is of the majority, you allow them to dictate the narratives of post-colonialism. Why is this harmful? Because the point at which you reject Western principles like democracy, like equality, that's when you allow for things like cutting out minority groups, etc., within politics to exist. Because on their side, minorities don't have because you're rejecting Western structures, you're rejecting Western principles of equality. And that is when all of their harms of oppressing queer minorities, oppressing racial minorities exist in their counterfactual. On our side of the house, the point at which we're debating this in the context of globalization, in a context where Western countries and colonization will always have this power asymmetry, at least on our side, we're able to engage with them and reap the benefits. At least on our side, we have unique benefits in terms of access to better education. We've taken this debate, give it to all.
Panel ready to continue? All right. I thank the speaker for that speech. And in order to conclude the substantive case to cite government, I would like to invite the Chief Government Whip. Here.
Can I be seen and heard? I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Side opposition loses the debate when they fail to recognize the nuance in our arguments and presume things out of the gate, right? Firstly, I'll be tackling the major contradiction that they presume that side proposition had in the case. They came out here and said that on our side of the house, we are saying that elites are forcing Western culture on the people, while simultaneously saying that elites are causing people to learn the local culture, right? Like learning Sinhala. We say that we clearly presented a nuance that they have missed because the elites are actively trying to are actively causing these people to learn Sinhala, but passively learning Western culture on their own. And this is what forces people to learn passive culture, because there's a nuance that we presented about how elites are the ones that are looked up to, about how the local people try to emulate the elites themselves, right? So when you have the elites themselves going to Western universities, a fact that they haven't contested, what we have is this local people also trying to emulate them and also trying to learn Western ideologies, which we do not prefer on our side of the house. They bring up this entire point about failing to see the mechanization of our counterfactual, but note that clearly in Ashwin's speech, we said that our counter mechanism was from the time of independence, right? It was from the age of liberalization, right after it. And the reason why side opposition can't actually see this counter mechanism working is that because they've become so engrossed in Western ideology that they can't even consider the fact that these colonies had their own culture, and this takes a very racist tone to the argument when the second speaker comes out here and says that Sri Lanka couldn't have developed universities on its own. Firstly, that's a very racist connotation, and secondly, that's a complete assumption, because recognize that even in colonies, they had their own sense of morality, right? It was only replaced with the westernized morality. And we recognize that firstly, westernized morality itself is flawed. And secondly, trying to emulate it is also immoral because you're letting go of your own cultures. I have two major clash points for the house today, right? Firstly, it's about the benefits and first is about the role of the elites in society, and secondly, it's about the benefits of westernization. So let's look at the entire assumption of elites, right? They come out here and say that they had unique benefits on their side, that elites on the side like D.S. Senanayaka actually went to England or actually went to foreign universities, gained their Western ideologies, and then used it to remove the Western influence in Sri Lanka. If that is the case, and because the best case is Western, is status quo, if they remove Western ideology, please answer this question for me. Why is one of the largest schools in Colombo named the British School in Colombo? Why are the roads on the street named after English people like Park Road? Why is it that we have this inherent sense of racism in CI students actually looking down on local students? Why is that? It's because of the sole narrative that is posed by accepting this Western ideology that English, somehow learning English makes you better than somehow learning Sinhala, right? This is something that we totally against on our side of the paradigm, and we recognize the irony as stated in speaker one, right? And moving on to this second argument about how elites actually did the best for the people by removing westernization. Note that this is completely an assumption, because what all the elites did was keep themselves in power, right? We've proven to you why elites themselves came to power, firstly as a result of colonization, and they played the situation so well that by adopting westernization, something they had a head start on, they managed to keep that power. Let me give an analogy, right? Supposedly you have two types of people in a race, right? Race to progress. You have a person who is an elite, who has learned Western ideologies, who has gone to foreign universities during time of colonization, and you have the local people who speak Sinhala or who speak Hindi, right? When the race begins after decolonization, and when you have westernization, the race of westernization ongoing, what you have this elites have firstly, they have a head start on you because they are already assimilated with the Western culture on their side of the house. They have gone to Western ideologies. They accept those culture. They have a head start on you. And secondly, they force the local people to learn Sinhala, which detriments them, right? Because of this entire structure. We do not say that learning Sinhala is detrimental, but we say that it has become detrimental due to status quo, due to this entire focus of Westernization. On our counterfactual, what we said that if we did not have this Westernization, learning Sinhala would have been more beneficial than learning English, and that Sri Lanka could have become a greater power. We wouldn't have to depend on these ideas of Western ideologies telling us that gay people are banned when we clearly have had monarchies on our side. Also, they come out and say that Western ideology is not about things like colonialism. Well, that's completely false, because we have proven to you how the West itself has gained all this power on due to the very prospect of colonization, right? And we say that we have pointed out several flaws in their thinking and their ideology that did not exist on our side of the house. What side opposition tries to paint a picture for you is that the Western ideology is completely true and do not actually accept the benefit that these colonial periods are had on this side. We gave you this example of democracy in Africa, and let me further expand on that. These tribes, they had one representative of the tribe, usually an older person who was wise, right? And these tribes, they got together and discussed what was best for all of the tribes. This resulted in things like less infighting, and right, and this is a system of democracy. What you have today in status quo, what side opposition is depending, is things like the Rwandan genocide that happened directly as a result of the elites going against the commoners, right? What you have is civil wars all over Africa because these elites continue to push this narrative of Westernization while simultaneously regretting their own local cultures, right? And an interesting point on this side of the house, when they say that on these elites actually do things like preserving the art. The only thing you preserve art when it's a dying form. On our side of the house, you wouldn't need to preserve Sri Lankan art because it was being practiced by every person because they recognize their own culture. Moving on to my second point about this entire idea of Westernization, right? Let me look at why the first basis of the first argument, which is really a straw man, right? Because they give all these points that don't really apply in real life, and the basis assumption, the base premise of their idea is that the elites became Westernized and came back and removed things such as oppressive structures, right? Firstly, I've proven to you in my first class point why this is false. And secondly, let's take a look at even if the elites did come back and removed all these structures, they still benefited as a whole, right? We have proven to you why there are unique harms to the common people on even in status quo, which they clearly haven't contented because they came out here and say that we are fine with status quo. This is a contradiction because they come out here and say that they do the best for all stakeholders, and then they concede that the elites are a minority and then defend status quo, where we see that elites as a minority are the ones who remain in power and the ones who have a head start on these local people. So their argument clearly does not stand in that side, right? Also, this entire second argument about they have this entire narrative of adapting to the colonist period, and the speaker one clearly mentions that we don't see the great deal in decolonization. Firstly, I find that highly insulting as an Indian who faced the horrors of colonization, where millions were murdered and massacred, and my culture was stolen away from me as brought by speaker was, and them coming out and saying that I need to adapt to a culture that says that the white person is superior, because recognize that all their notions of betterment and progress are based inherently on Western values, which we say that we regret, right? Because so they can't come out here and say that we have harms on the side, on our side, when they don't actually attack our principle of why Westernization itself is bad as a whole, right? Also, moving to my final point about why we benefit all stakeholders, right? We benefit the minorities, the elites, because they themselves become more culturally enhanced with their own culture instead of becoming a bastardized white man. And also they become, the minorities themselves have a chance to be more better. And for all these reasons, so far proposed.
Panel ready to go? Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech. And now I would like to invite Chief Opposition Whip to conclude the substantive case for side opposition. Here.
Hi, can you hear me if I speak like this? Cool. As much as I would love to give credit to all of the flowery analysis that Ashwin gave us about how terrible colonization is, I think there's a clear counterfactual that they need to engage with in this debate. They didn't make it clear what they stand for. They told us that they want a world in which individuals decolonize actively in order to get the oppressors out. But here is why their counterfactual is vague at best, but impossible at worst. Given the fact that the reason that colonizers had such a huge edge over our countries was because of the fact that people didn't understand how to infiltrate their structures. They didn't understand how to them incentives to get out of our own countries. How did they learn this? Because they went to universities, and Western universities at the time were the only accessible form of education that you could get outside your very own country. And even if they weren't the most, even if they were the only universities that you could get, those are the most important ones, because they were the ones that taught you things like how to govern countries, how to understand philosophical ideals that Ashwin benefits so much from in this debate in itself. The important part here is then, panel, that in the absence of people going to university and understanding these structures, you would have unlikely been able to get rid of colonizers altogether. Why is this a counterfactual that they didn't want to engage with? Absolutely no analysis across all three of their speeches. It is way too late to bring it up in reply. There are three main questions in this speech. The first is if westernization of elites ultimately results in the deterioration of culture. The second is on the influence that elites have over the populace altogether. And finally, if you are able to get the advantages of globalization and be able to make the best of colonization altogether. Under my first clash, I want to make it very clear that they told you the only reasons that it is a problematic thing to engage in colonial structures that were imposed was because of the fact that you are conceding to the harms of colonization. I think this is just a problem stance for them to take in general, because note that a lot of the things that we stand by in society right now, things like education and schooling, which is something that I'm sure the proposition doesn't disagree with either, are also things that were imposed to us as a result of colonial powers. If they accepted one of our POIs, are they willing to then disassemble all of these structures that exist? Do they regret all of the benefits that we got as a result of those structures? There is no analysis on their side of the house. But let's deal with the biggest thing that they had to say in this debate about the fact that you wipe out local culture in the search for westernization. This is why this analysis is not working, because of the fact that we need to engage with this in several different contexts. Let's engage with it right after the colonizers left our country. When that happened, we didn't have local universities to bank on. And given their vague counterfactual, I'm going to assume that that's the only avenue of higher education that you would have likely been able to obtain. In the absence of you being able to access local education, their counterfactual is a world in which individuals would have probably not been educated on how to dismantle structures or govern countries in the first place. I mean, if you want to engage in a world in which you operate based on the monarchies that existed in the past, I can give you plenty of reasons why those things were incredibly problematic. But importantly, this is what ultimately helped us to restore our culture, because there was a recognition that colonizers completely wiped out every single ounce of culture that we had remaining. So when these individuals went to Western universities, our local elites were then able to realize that governing structures exist wherein you are able to then inculcate our local culture back into the sphere again. That is incredibly important for the way in which you're able to increase the amount of culture that our country is able to have in the first place. So they want to talk about the minute harms that you have as a result of the Colombo people looking down on the rest. Note that in their counterfactual, you would have unlikely been able to have any sort of reversal as a result of the cultural issues that existed, because you wouldn't have had anybody who had the education to be able to do that. But I'm going to flip that, and this is where we flip their analysis. Because in the context of status quo, most post-colonial states still have their primary languages remain local. Look at Sri Lanka, look at Japan, look at China. So they need to give me an example of how it is true that westernization has actively wiped out the existence of any individual being able to appreciate their own culture, and why westernization of local elites uniquely is what has wiped out a country's ability to be able to maintain their culture. But secondly, most schools and local governing structures have people become their presidents and have people govern them, even if they're not part of the westernized culture. Why are they engaging with elites as a monolith? No, I will take you before my second clash. Why are they engaging with elites as a monolith? We told you importantly that they're a diverse group of people. Why is it so problematic that a number of them engage in westernization? Absolutely no analysis. The biggest harm that they told you on their side is that there are microaggressions against individuals who aren't able to form perfect sentences in English. We think that that's a small price to pay because of the fact that those things are evolving over time, and importantly, because in the absence of this westernization, you wouldn't have had the education to reverse the cultural whitewashing that colonizers imposed on us. Before my second clash, I'll take a PO.
Ma'am, on your case, considering it's after going to those foreign unis that these politicians enacted these laws like the single only language, how?
Yeah, if you're conceding that even after you go to a Western university, you're still likely to preserve your culture, then I don't understand what you're defending in this debate. My second clash then is on the influence that elites have on their side of the house, because they assumed that elites are able to set a normative standard for what is considered an acceptable avenue of education in all cases. We told you that that's not necessarily true because of the fact that people still get elected irrespective of whether they go to a Western university or not, because elites balance each other out. And this is important analysis that we gave you from the start, but to which there was absolutely no response, because some elites are westernized, but others do in fact go to local universities that are unlikely to have existed in the absence on their side of the house of people learning what university structures really look like in the first place. So, but importantly, going to Western universities isn't as inaccessible as they mentioned. We told you that you don't have to be at the top of the top to be able to get to a Western university. But even if it is true that that is the case, note that people can still branch out and go to other universities as well. On the absolute best case, if elites are so influential, then it is likely that the same harms are likely to accrue regardless of whatever avenue of education they chose to take, which means that the best universities in their own local countries are the ones that are likely to be highlighted the most. If they decided to go to university in the East, those are the things that are likely to be desired anyway. If elites are influential and as influential as they mentioned, and they're able to set a normative standard, might as well do that by getting an influential, like a proper form of education, which they're able to get on our side of the house. And this leads me to my final clash on why you're better able to engage with the globalized world that we exist in. Because we told you that it is inevitable on both sides of the house that colonizers have set a normative standard for how countries are able to structure themselves, which means that they disassemble the past structures that countries operate with. And this is not just for a period of a decade, so you can reverse it very quickly. We're talking about hundreds of years of just absolute imposition of ideology. On our side of the house, when you are better able to go to a university, you are able to get the education in a Western context that is incredibly important, because it is the Western world that is able to teach you things like philosophy, things like economics, things like politics, that they have a unique hold on because they have been doing it for the longest period of time. You are then able to bring it back to your country and impose those structures that fit your nation as well. Because I think the analysis is unrealistic, because they told you that all countries are like following this liberal standard and don't care about their local economy. Look at Sri Lanka panel. They already care about their local economy as well. They didn't explain to us why all the harm on their side are extremely unique to westernization of elites. They only engage with an anti-colonial stand for all of those reasons opposed.
Panel ready to go? Awesome. So that concludes the substantive round. Now moving on to reply speeches. In order to deliver a reply speech from side opposition, I would like to invite the speaker from side opposition. Here.
Can I be heard clearly? Panel, the westernization of elites that we're talking about in the House today did not start happening in a vacuum. It started happening a long time ago when structures of colonization were imposed upon these countries. And our people who were in the upper echelons of society then had to adapt under those conditions if we were going to get rid of these Europeans anyway. And it's something that paved the way for independence and the reason why we have any kind of cultural revival in the status quo. That is the paradigm that side proposition needs to regret and tell you why they're solving those issues on their side. 3 speeches, and we still don't know how DS Serenayaka and his peers would have asked for legislation that involves Sri Lankans in democratic processes without knowing English, without knowing concepts of democracy by going to foreign universities, and without pointing out the hypocrisy of those Westerners. They're counterfactual. Let's assume that all these elites start clinging to local culture, and therefore they don't have any kind of political or social capital to actually do these things. But let's just assume that they somehow manage to get rid of colonizers. Even then, what incentive do these people then have to start liberalizing our country and start imposing the kind of democracy that they have now? These were all people who are feudal lords and monarchs, and they're much more likely to stay that way in side proposition's best case. Understand that all of their benefits only accrue when they tell you that these people are able to gain independence and liberalize on their side of the house. At the point at which colonization happens on either side of the house, the debate is then about who has learned to adapt and has finally started to rebuild local culture. We achieve that best, and therefore we win this debate. 2 main questions then. Firstly, on which side can actually restore culture the best? 2 points of context that both sides have agreed on, right? We agree that colonization itself has done a lot in wiping out local culture. And we, as side opposition, told you that westernization itself is a form of equalizer in the kind of capital that we have to then combat that erasure of culture. Side proposition argues this. They tell you that you have this sort of implicit following of elites because people aspire to be like the rich, they aspire to be like the powerful. No analysis as to why that is mutually exclusive, right? You're likely to follow the rich and the elite in any kind of society, and that happens anyway on their side. And they tell you, and we told you that cultural integration is something that is extremely complex. Just because you start thinking or speaking in English doesn't mean that you suddenly don't celebrate festivals or you don't travel around your country and appreciate the culture that they have. They needed to prove you why that sort of thing is mutually exclusive and exists as a monolith. They haven't done that. We also told you that political incentives exist to make sure that this culture is preserved in status quo. Why? Because you have a vast majority of people who do value culture, who do care about their local languages. Our leaders are not going to start getting rid of those things as a whole. They also tell you that Western culture is inherently problematic. I already told you why that is simply not the case. The means through which people started to colonize is obviously flawed, but things like culture, things like democracy, and the liberal ideas that sprung up in Europe were not things that were inherently flawed or inherently bad. At that point, that question falls onto our side as well. The second question then becomes, which side has a country that is adapted to globalization and facing the world after colonization? They told you that in their counterfactual, Sinhala and learning local languages like Tamil wouldn't have been detrimental because these local elites clung on to them anyway. I already told you why that is not likely to happen, but even if that was true, the reality that you have to face is that countries like Europe and English-speaking countries held hegemony and cultural hegemony over the world long before colonization. That is the world that you will then have to adapt to and learn to live in anyway. On our side of the house, we have elites and political leaders who are well-versed in English and well-versed in political ideas that come directly from the West. This is the only mechanism through which you have an equalizer of the power asymmetries that then exist. Now you're able to protect our countries against the political influence that they exert over us. For all of these reasons, because we clearly defended our counterfactual, we urge you to oppose.
Panel, shall we continue? All right. In order to conclude the case for side government, I would like to invite a speaker from the government. Here.
Thank you. I can be heard, yeah? Great. Panel, as much as Chirathi is a good friend of mine, I have to say this is definitely not their best, like the best case I've seen her give. Because from the very start of this debate, the opposition's case was not about the westernization of like elites in post-colonial states, as the motion says, but rather about defending colonial influence. This debate was not about how we gained independence. It was about how after you gain independence, you get like rid of the influence that colonialism had. We can completely concede that we maybe wouldn't have gotten independence without D.S. Senanayaka going to Oxford. That's not the point here. We can concede the importance of Western education before independence. That doesn't show why we should support Westernization of the elite as a concept, and it also doesn't prove why it matters after you've gotten independence. So their entire case isn't comparative. But in the mass majority of cases, they don't like. Their case doesn't agree with our metric, and they didn't concede with our metric. This was to say that we don't care about engaging with the globalized community if engaging with the globalized community means you don't get the cultural liberation that you want. So considering that, there are two clashes that like actually remain in this debate, and there's one clash that is like the most important clash that we've already won from the very start. So I'm going to deal with that first, and that is the clash on liberation. Because the reason why they lose this from the very start is firstly because they have no competing material on it, but secondly, in through their rebuttal, they ignore the nuance of that like clash. Because this debate was not about eliminating Western culture completely or about how Westernization eliminates local culture completely. It's about prioritization of one culture over the other. It's about how that culture was used to distinguish the elite from the poor. That's what my entire first argument was about. They've had 4 speeches now, and they haven't dealt with it. Our first argument still stands on the basis of mechanism, because the mechanism we told you about, that being aspiration, which they concede to, hasn't been rebutted. Because yes, aspiration towards the elite happens on both sides. That's the point. On our side, when you aspire towards the elite aren't westernized anymore. That's the entire crux of this argument that they haven't dealt with. So I'm going to be very charitable towards their case. I'm going to deal with like 2 remaining questions. The first is this idea of democracy and westernization. The second is this idea of education, jobs, etc. So onto this idea of democracy and westernization. And I think it's really like strange that they claim that westernization and colonialism gave us democracy. We were under a dictatorship known as the monarchy of the queen. That like Western culture in and of itself has constantly gotten rid of democracy when it suits them. But democracy on its own isn't a good thing. We are completely fine with a system that's not democratic if it means that we are treated fairly, if it means that we are in a system that means we are liberated from the shackles of colonialism. The only things remaining here then are these ideas of trade and being able to speak at the UN, etc. Look, there are systems in place that exist that cater to things like this. The example of Japan is like a perfect example. Like no one in Japan speaks English. You still see Japan at the UN because things like translators exist. Trade exists because trade is a necessity in the modern world and isn't dependent on your analysis or like your cooperation with Western cultures. So this entire idea about how democracy and westernization wouldn't have happened without colonialism is just bad and isn't what this debate was supposed to be about. But secondly, this idea of education, jobs, etc. And this is just, I think, a really racist argument because they ignore the idea that education can exist without westernization. Sri Lanka established unis after colonialism, without colonial influence. But those universities are better off without westernization because you don't have to conform and change your culture to meet the needs of Western individuals or Western standards of what it means to be professional. So they haven't responded to the crux of this clash, which is the social disparity you create in terms of things like capital, in terms of things like intellectual representation in top universities. That is the key part of our second argument that they haven't dealt with. Because their case is non-comparative and because they probably just didn't read the motion despite having 1 full hour to do so, they lose this debate. Propose, get rid of the colonial stain.
Thank you, Speaker. And now we would like to ask all the observers and the debaters to remain in this room while the judges move on to a separate room, I assume. Sanit, do we have a separate room? Are we going to A1 Prof?
Yeah, we can go to A1 Prof.
Okay. So we'll deliberate and get back as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thanks, Elsie. Good debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.